Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Saturday. Yeah, that's right. I'm working on a Saturday. But the offer was too good, and you'll see why in a minute. December the 18th, the year of our Lord, 2021. I'm Raheem Kassam, editor-in-chief of the National Pulse, broadcasting from a miserable Capitol Hill right now. Gloomy, dreary, and of course everything else the same as well. Making it miserable here in Washington, D.C. But I gotta tell you, I'm excited about our guest today. Not least because I spent the morning. I know the regular listeners of this podcast know that Natalie and we like to listen to things on 2 times, sometimes even 3 times speed. I'm actually not up to 3 times speed yet. But I was listening this morning to Shari Markson's excellent book, and if you don't have it yet, What Really Happened in Wuhan is just such an extraordinary telling of the events that a lot of the media, most of the media, don't want to have to grapple with. I understand CNN's grappling with a few other things right now, but Shari nails it, and I think it's a must-read for everybody. And as I was going through the book this morning, I thought, wow, if only every person in the Western world can be exposed in some way to what Shari talks about in this book, especially as it pertains to what China did right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, then I think we would all be a little bit better off. And somebody else who really, truly understands that is our guest today. I hope will be the congressman for Washington's 3rd Congressional District. Joe Kent joins us. Joe, thank you so much for making time this Saturday.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Joe, I don't know if you've read Shari Markson's book, What Really Happened in Wuhan. I'm only about 2/3 of the way through it right now, but it's an epic telling from real sources, a lot of named sources, people who wanted to put their names to these things about what happened early on, well, late on in 2019, early on in 2020, and the corruption, really, between the World Health Organization, the Chinese Communist Party, and unfortunately, of course, many people in my country, the United Kingdom, in your country, the United States, in Australia, Shari Markson's country, and elsewhere. Have you had a chance to get into that?
I haven't. I have the book ordered. I don't have it yet. But I've heard her interviews, obviously, on War Room, and followed her for quite a while. So it's I'm looking forward to digging into it. But I think there's so much evidence that's been laid out now about the origins of the virus and everything that the Western governments, in particular the United States, did with Fauci to really cover up the origins. I mean, I think we're at an inflection point right now where we have the information. More of it obviously needs to come out, but we've got to find a way to take action.
And to that end, you wrote this amazing article. I'm very grateful for it, by the way. Flattered that we could publish it at the National Pulse. It's time for reparations for China's COVID-19 carnage. And you lay out the case in a very, if you don't mind me saying it, a very Navarro-esque way, a very forceful way about why, we don't right now just need to be talking about the culpability of the people on our own shores, but also actually holding the Chinese Communist Party to account. And as I was listening to Shari's book this morning, going back through a lot of the details, going back to, I won't ruin it for you in totality, because actually, for as grim a subject matter as it is, it's, I'll use the word enjoyable, but it's enjoyable in the sense that you learn so much over such a short period of time in that book. And, I think you get it. In this article, you nail it. So let me ask you this, right? We talk about reparations. We talk about China's culpability here. But one of the things that became abundantly clear to me very early on in the pandemic, and Shari makes a very good case for it in her book, is that there are just so many interests, right? There are so many interests whose worlds would be shattered apart, whether it's the pharmaceutical companies, whether it's the World Health Organization. So let's start with a point of realism. How realistic is it to be able to hold China to account when you've got so many interests in our own countries who are pushing back against that?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the realistic, or the way that you frame it. How realistic is this? I mean, I would kind of flip it and say, how realistic is it that we can continue to survive like this, being so intertwined with the Chinese Communist Party, where they're exploiting us to such a great extent? How long can our country survive? Like, if we don't take action now, I think that we are going to look back on this and we're not going to have much of a country left. I mean, between the way they took advantage of COVID, the way they're deeply intertwined, at every level with Wall Street and the Beltway, if we don't start this fight now, it's probably going to be too late. I think we still have a lot of things going in our favor, but we're going to have to start fighting the Chinese Communist Party. And really, I think that first fight, I mean, we talk about fighting the Chinese Communist Party, but what that really looks like, I think, is fighting our elite right here at home first.
We talk a lot about that, right? The elite and the elite, the idea of elite capture. We like to talk about it more in terms of elite merger, right? There were these two oligarchies on different sides of the world that realized, hey, if we all work together, then ordinary people aren't going to be able to assail us. So, in your mind, where does that assault begin? How do we start that process of holding both sets of elites to account?
I think the COVID reparations is a good spot, because I think your average American who's not deeply following, the news or the larger issues, they probably wouldn't. I mean, a couple of years ago, they probably really wouldn't understand how intertwined we are with China. I do think people are waking up to it now. But COVID, regardless of how people have been affected, it is, wreak havoc on our country, especially the economy. People's lives have been upended. Pretty much everyone has. So I think starting with COVID and the amount of lies that our own bureaucracy has told us, and we've had the largest transfer of wealth from small independent businesses all the way up to the corporate structure, the largest one we've ever had in the history of our country. So I think starting with a congressional committee that really lays out what the government knew, when they knew it, what China knew, and then pull no punches. I mean, guys like Fauci, he's been trying to cover his tracks now for the last 2 years or so. We've got him pretty much dead to rights, lying to Congress, lying to Senator Rand Paul under oath. So I think that's a good starting point, and then we need to look at the totality of just how intertwined we are and kind of make that a larger economic trade issue, because every advantage that China has over us, it kind of goes back to, hey, these guys really, they control our supply lines. We rely on them to buy up our debt bonds to keep our currency afloat. It's such a huge problem. But I would use what actually happened to borrow the title of the book. What actually happened in Wuhan, and what did our government, especially Fauci and the NIH, what did they know and when did they know it? Let's get to the bottom of that and lay that out for the American people.
Why is it, do you think? And this is something that bothers me almost more on a day-to-day basis than the actions of the CCP or the actions of Fauci, because we know that those people are necessarily hostile. They're hostile to, if you're Anthony Fauci, you're hostile to the idea of basic liberties, I think, as Americans know them. If you're the Chinese Communist Party, you're allergic almost in your policy prescriptions to free markets, to free peoples, to the idea of what America has stood for so very long. But what really gets my goat up is why Republicans, you mentioned Rand Paul there, but unfortunately you can only count them on one hand, the number of Republicans here on Capitol Hill that are willing to really not just go up against Fauci in a committee. That's the easy part, but to deal with all the media fallout and all everything else on the back end of that. Why is that, and how do you see that from your post up there in Washington State?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's very few Republicans that are actually going to call this out, and then not just push back against Fauci at a bigger picture, but then push back on all the petty tyranny. I mean, here in Washington State, we have a governor who he's locked our economy down. He forced the statewide vaccine mandates that cost people their jobs. Like it's up in people's faces, and there's a handful, but there's a very few Republicans that are calling that out and going after it. The woman I'm going against, Jamie Herr Butler, Trump impeachment voter, Rhino, she takes money from Johnson & Johnson. She's actually praised the actions of Jay Inslee, our governor. So I think really it gets to the core, and I think some of it maybe is complex if you get into the financial industry and how lobbyists work and all that. I think that's definitely a play. I don't want to discount that, but really there is the simple Trump derangement syndrome. Donald Trump really made his name by calling out, our imbalance in trade, really pointed out to the American people how the crisis that we have right now with the Chinese Communist Party and how they're using currency manipulation and intellectual property theft. And he changed that entire narrative, and that the whole corporate structure of the lobbyists, the donors, the press, they rejected that, and they really rejected it because he was right. When he started to bring back some of the manufacturing, we had the largest, raise in working class wages that we had seen in decades. And so a lot of this, and especially the way that Trump at the early phases of the pandemic, he started calling out, hey, this is China. We need to have a travel ban against China. And then immediately the most, typical response from the left is that this is some sort of this is racism, this is nationalism, this is xenophobia. All of that, I think, is just becomes such a blunt tool that Republicans are scared of. And I don't know why they're scared of it, because we know they're going to use it every single time. But I think that's still out there. And Republicans have been, very hesitant to call this out for what it is, just an authoritarian power grab.
And you write in your article, and I commend this to everybody, not just because it means more people will click onto the nationalpulse.com. That's always a good thing. But it's detailed, right? This isn't just rhetoric. What you're talking about is actual things that can be done. And of course, one of the things that you mention is effectively, crippling sanctions on businesses that continue to freely work with the Chinese Communist Party against the interests of the United States. I think about that and that paragraph of your article, and it brings to mind Hamilton's report on the subject of manufactures, right, from 1791. Because, I think being a Brit, a lot of Americans will joss each other about the revolution, but then when we get into actual discussions about it, there's a very surface level learning that's gone on in this country about your revolution. There's absolutely no learning, by the way, about that period of time in my country, funnily enough. We like to bury that one, not remember it too well. But I always like to say that, the revolution, the Declaration of Independence wasn't the period of time in and of itself when America really became a functioning nation. It took some time, and it really actually took until after 1812 for America to assert itself as an independent nation. But one of the things that was pivotal toward that was Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacture, 1791. Effectively, Treasury Secretary Hamilton said at the time, you can't have a functioning nation without your own manufacturing base at home. You will always, therefore, be reliant upon a foreign power. A foreign power might always turn hostile on you. And that's kind of the same thing as we're seeing now, where, in the years after all the craze about the Hamilton musical and all this stuff, we fail to remember the one thing that I actually think was the most pertinent part of nation building at home that Hamilton offered, which is, hey, you actually need to make stuff for yourself. You cannot be reliant on hostile powers. And so talk to us a little bit about, the part in your article where you talk about bringing manufacturing home, bringing, reliance on China, reliance on anybody, quite frankly, to heal.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think we have to get on a wartime footing with, because right now, America, Donald Trump said it very, very simply and plainly during the 2016 campaign, we don't make anything anymore. And that sort of sounds like a bumper sticker, but when you dig into it, it's like we actually don't make anything here really anymore. We rely on the Chinese Communist Party to be the world's manufacturer, and we are deeply intertwined with them. We saw what happened with the pandemic. We couldn't make basic PPE. We couldn't make vitamins. We couldn't make any kind of medical supplies that we needed. So this is a crisis. We don't make anything, but also what that did was that outsourced all of our labor, and it made it very difficult for someone to simply leave high school and be able to get a decent paying job. That's when we started this whole hollowing out of our economy. Not only do we not make anything anymore, but there's no upward mobility for the vast majority of people in the country. There's only so many different college degrees that you can get white collar office work. And that's the myth that we sold people basically from, the late 70s into the 80s and up until now, that there's no more decent blue collar jobs available. And that's really hollowed out the base of our country, had a catastrophic effect on all these small towns. Opioid addiction comes in, lack of purpose, families start breaking up. So it's had this huge social ramification that I think we should be deeply concerned about, just for the health of our own people. But then from a national security perspective, I mean, Hamilton was a genius. He knew that there was no way that we could have to rely on another country. And it's not like the CCP is Canada and we share some sort of cultural bonds with them. Like this couldn't be a more different country than us, and there's an ocean in between us, so there's always logistics issues. But really, the way that we have the globalist plan to say that, hey, we'll overlook the fact that China is willing to use slave labor, that they're willing to use child labor. We'll overlook that because we're going to get cheap goods here. Consequences be damned. This is going to be a net positive for the American people. Well, that was all a lie. We had the catastrophic consequences on the working class. And then now we have this issue where the Chinese Communist Party controls all of our means of production. So I think we have to get extremely aggressive about it. And this is where I think I part ways with a lot of traditional Republicans who say that you can't ever interfere with the sacred free market. I think this is where we actually have to have the government come in and say, hey, if you want to produce anything that's going to be sold in this country, you need to make it in this country with American hands. Otherwise, we will simply tariff you into non-existence. I'm good with using the tools of the government to offer some of these manufacturing companies, free land, very lucrative tax incentives to bring back their manufacturing. I think we should be rewarding companies and corporations if they're willing to be patriotic and view this as a wartime effort, the way our country rallied around the flag and switched over industries in the Second World War. But the companies that want to play cute with us and try and keep their means of production elsewhere, I think we just tariff them into non-existence. And this is something we just have to take very seriously.
It's an incredibly bold fight to proclaim the standard of, given the scale of the animus towards an idea like that. I mean, you're talking about taking on all of the vested interests in the media class, all of the vested interests in the hospitality industry, all of the vested interests, quite frankly, in whatever's left of a lot of the manufacturing industries in America, because they deal so much with Chinese companies to, bring parts in, and maybe, you see those signs. I remember seeing signs growing up when I was visiting America that said "Made in America," right? And now you see signs that say "Assembled in America," and it's like, I know what you're doing. You're not fooling anybody with this. But it's such a large undertaking, and it's an undertaking whereby, Joe, they will demonize you to the hilt. They will stop at nothing to make you look like the boogeyman in that whole thing. Are you telling me that, to put it bluntly, that Republicans I won't even say Republicans, frankly, because I have no affinity. I don't feel anything about the Republican Party. But conservatives or people who care about this country, patriots, are you telling me that they just need to kind of grow a pair?
I mean, yeah, to put it very simply, that's it. That's the bottom line. And then really just, I would encourage people to do the math and the critical thinking. Like, if things continue this way, where do you see our country on every level? If we continue to hollow out our manufacturing base and it's impossible for young people to get a decent manufacturing job, what does that leave them with? What has COVID shown us that the government's willing to do? Well, they're willing to lock us down, take away our jobs, and then just send people money. So then we're on our way to becoming some form of a, whatever you want to call it, communism. I think it's total control. Authoritarianism is the direction that we're heading. But then also China, who has a question nowadays other than maybe Joe Biden? Does China have the best interests at store for the American people? They don't, and we give them this power of controlling our manufacturing. Look at what they did best case scenario with COVID. They didn't give us a heads up when they had a lab leak. I believe it's much more nefarious than that. And we rely on them. We continue to run up our national debt, but we rely on them to buy up our debt bonds. Like, this is not sustainable. And I have a background in the military, and you just can't let problems fester in the military. At some point, you're going to have to go and fight. And for me right now, we still have somewhat of an advantage just because of the juggernaut of an economic power that our country is for the time being. And if we don't fight right now, we're going to lose the ability to ever push back.
It is waning, isn't it? I mean, you can see the ability to fight back waning in front of our eyes, and you just think, when is this country going to understand? I sit here, I'm in Washington D.C., I'm in my house on Capitol Hill, and in front of me I have a map of the British Empire at its peak. Right, it was glorious, as far as I'm concerned. And you look at that now, and you think, wow, how did it all disappear so quickly? And it was very much the same thing, right? We hollowed out our own nation. We hollowed out, exported all of the jobs. Thought we could import everything. Thought, hey, we're friends. We plant our flag all around the world, and therefore the world will be friends of ours. And it just didn't work out like that. And I think a lot of Americans are starting to feel that way too. That America has planted its flag in so many places all across the world, whether it has been, via conflict, via frankly, bribery in some cases. I mean, there hasn't really been a very serious American foreign policy. Well, I might say ever, but the foreign policy class in Washington D.C. didn't seem to understand, because I don't think they're very bright, frankly. I mean, I talk to these people all the time, and if you're listening, I don't think you're very bright. To the people on K Street and all of those guys, but also they just don't care. Their pockets aren't lined by Americans getting more wealthy.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, to your point, our foreign policy class, the national security blob, or whatever you want to call them, they really are just looking for the next foreign adventure to get us into, and they're not worried about these large systemic issues. They're not really. It's crazy. We call them, the national security state. Our national security is the last thing they're worried about. They're worried about finding. Yeah, they're worried about finding another place to send foreign aid, because that's the easiest way to recycle money back to the Beltway. Or even better, if you can start a new war and you can get everybody freaked out about the Russians and Ukraine, and you can threaten nuclear war. These are the adults in the room that we were told were so smart. They can threaten nuclear war, potentially get us into another war. And what does any of that have to do with securing our country? If they really cared about securing our country, they'd be talking about what we're discussing right now, our manufacturing base, and what's going on with relying on the CCP to buy up our debt bonds. It's really quite a joke. And I think we just have to have people that don't want to genuflect to these so-called experts anymore, but call them out for exactly what they are. They're selfish, silly, and sometimes seditious people.
I like that a lot. And what I like especially about that is the national security point. They're not the national security apparatus. They're the international insecurity apparatus.
Exactly.
Everything these people have done around the world has not just made America less safe, less secure, and less self-reliant, but has also made the world less secure. And that is such a great point that I'm writing it down right now. Joe, I want to ask you something, and ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Joe Kent, running for Congress in Washington's 3rd Congressional District. Joe, what is your website, by the way, so people can go there?
Yeah, JoeKentForCongress.com.
JoeKentForCongress.com. We'll put it in the description on the podcast as well, and make sure I'll talk about it at the end of this podcast as well. I want to take you back to something you just said, which I glossed over a little bit, but I think requires some more unpacking, and that is the leak, right? The leak of this virus. I think most serious people nowadays don't think that somebody had a badly made soup and then the world got sick. I think all evidence points to some far more nefarious activities. And indeed, the Chinese dissidents in Washington, D.C., who have been here for a very long time, back in November of 2019, were talking about this. And we're talking about the PLA and the PLA's application of bioweapons projects taking place in that BSL-4 lab in Wuhan, and how just, what a wild coincidence. The place that this originated was where they had this lab. So let me ask you that question: we talk about the lab leak theory. Does any part of you think perhaps that we're talking about intent behind COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, it's always. I mean, with my background in intel, proving intent is very difficult. But I mean, if you look at there's a bioweapons lab there. We now know, thanks to the work that you guys did, National Pulse and some others, that, we funded gain-of-function research. This is exactly what they were doing there. They were working on, COVID biological weapons, essentially. And they had leaks before. I mean, we have the State Department cables. You guys found the State Department cables that said, like, hey, these guys occasionally leak out viruses because they don't have the best procedures there. But what I think we can prove, like, do we know exactly on the day that COVID-19 jumped out of that lab, was it the PLA saying, okay, on this date, release it, let's see what happens? Or was it, oh no, we have a leak? Well, what we do know is what happened next. Now, had the Chinese Communist Party been this great global organization that just wants to cooperate and research, the globalist fantasy that we get told by the adults in the room and the Davos crowd, if that was how they acted, they would have told us. They would have said, hey, that gain of function thing that we're all paying for, we just had a leak. We're locking things down. Like, there would have been steps taken. But we now know that this started back in the fall of 19, when all of us were completely oblivious to it. And so that's what I think we can prove. We can prove that, hey, maybe, I don't know if we'll ever know. I'd like to do the research and figure out if we can get to the bottom of whether they intended for it to leak out at that time. But once it was out, the Chinese Communist Party's intent was to fully exploit it. And they didn't share any information. They continued to send people all over the world to buy up PPE. They sent people all over the world to spread the virus, and then they had our elites. Fauci was absolutely he didn't say anything. He was trying to cover his tracks. And then our media did zero due diligence. The media basically made the lab leak theory this like QAnon conspiracy theory. That's basically what you were called for about a year if you even brought it up. And now it's out there, and it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, it probably did come from the Wuhan lab. But I mean, this is something that for me, it goes back to the actions they took once that virus jumped out of the lab. That's what to me is completely nefarious and says pretty much everything that you need to know about the Chinese Communist Party.
I think that's absolutely right. A really pivotal moment we're living through here. Joe, just before I want to get into you a little bit and talk about your background and how you came to this moment. But in the article, you mentioned the timber industry. Now, I don't know much about the timber industry. I'll tell a funny story. I was supposed to be. I was ordained as a minister in order to officiate a marriage between some friends of mine a couple of years ago, and I was so busy at the time that I didn't really pay attention to the sleeping arrangements up in Maine where we were staying. So I said to my buddy Rob, I said, "Hey, you just figure it all out. Just get us into a hotel. Tell me where I'm sleeping. I'm just along for the ride here." And we get up there and we pull up to this cabin in the woods. And I said, "Rob, what is this?" He says, "This is where we're staying." He's from Alabama. I won't try and do the accent. And he says, "This is where we're staying." I said, "Does this place have Wi-Fi?" He said, "No, I don't think so." I said, "Because I'm not getting any cell signal here either." He goes, "Yeah, no, you won't." I said, "Rob, I run a news website. I can't just be out of the loop for the next 3 days." He's like, "Oh man, I'm sorry, I didn't even think of it." Anyway, so we have to settle in, and we quickly realize that it's winter, and there's no heating in this place, and there's a little fireplace inside. And I said to him, "Well, do you know how to build a fire?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, I don't know how to build a fire, and we can't get on YouTube right now either to learn how to build a fire. So we're just gonna have to figure out how to build a fire." And we went outside. There was an axe by the door, so I took this axe. And you got to understand, I'm in my suit trousers, a shirt. I got my laptop under my arm. I'm a city boy, okay, in case you didn't realize. And we go outside, and there are all these kind of half chopped logs up on this tree stump. And I said, "Well, I guess we have to chop those, and then we put them in the thing, and then we find a way to light it." I've heard of kindling. I understand the general basics of all of this. But he took this picture of me, Joe, which is just me in my shirt and suit trousers. I've got a cigarette hanging out of the corner of my mouth, and with one arm I'm just wielding this axe and barely landing any blows on these logs. Long story short, we do get the fire going in the end. And by the way, I'm not the one who ends up falling asleep in front of the fire. I have to, I go to sleep in my bed. Somebody else gets to enjoy the fire that I built. But I don't know. With that story in mind, I don't know much about the timber industry, but I believe it is emblematic of a lot of the other things that you get at in this article. So can you tell us a little bit about why specifically you talk about the timber industry and deregulation around it?
Yeah, so I mean, the timber industry out here in the Pacific Northwest was the beating heart of our economy. I mean, really up until the 80s, we started to have the environmental movement that really took aim at the timber industry, kind of passed law after law. And again, the federal government owns so much of the land in the West that federal regulations that prevent things like logging due to endangered species. We have an endangered species of owl out here that really was used as a reason to shut down a lot of our logging industry out here. And so that happened, well, I wouldn't say gradually, that happened over the course of about throughout the 80s and the 90s. Our timber industry, the ability to actually go out and harvest our own timber was drastically limited due to over-government regulation. But then the double whammy of it, because the logging industry was big for young men to go out and be lumberjacks and physically cut down the trees. But what actually employed more people was the production of the lumber. So our sawmills employed a lot of folks out here, great manufacturing style jobs. You could get it right out of high school and you could stay there really until you retired. This is how people made their livings out here. But a lot of the sawmills, thanks to all the trade deals that we cut throughout the 90s and the 2000s, they got shipped out. So we would harvest some timber, a limited amount, of timber here in the Pacific Northwest, but then it would get shipped either up to Canada or some of it over to Japan to be processed and turned into lumber, shipped back here and sold at an exorbitant price. So it's kind of like a triple whammy. We killed off the actual people that go out and harvest the timbers. We killed off the ability to manufacture it here. And then we drove the price of housing up because now we're importing the exact same timber that we just plucked out of our own forests. And then I would say the fourth gut punch is the environmental implication. So since we're not harvesting the timber, we're not actually going out and logging, we're not building logging roads, we're not clearing out the lumber rush consistently, we've had catastrophic wildfires I know everyone's familiar with throughout California, throughout Oregon, Washington. Summer before last was really bad. I mean, the whole region was literally in flames, and fire crews couldn't actually get out to where a lot of these fires were started by lightning or other natural causes because there were no more logging roads. And then the forest essentially become this massive tinderbox because there's so much undergrowth too. So the logging industry has just been absolutely decimated. And I think it's very similar, like you said, to every other industry. I mean, you could really replace the word timber with coal and, up in Detroit, the automotive industry, the steel industry. It's just that same sad story where you drive through towns in the Pacific Northwest that were once thriving that you just can't, if you're born there, if you're from there, you can't get a job there anymore. You're forced to, again, take the college loan debt and then move to the city and hope that you can get a job in some other industry. But then so many of those jobs have been taken away by H-1B visas and then just the whole gig economy that you can see what's been happening with our economy on a generational scale. And this is something that, a lot of the really super smart people like the Obama, well, you can't bring them back. They'll say it like it's a law of nature. It's like, well, no, these were all decisions made by governments and by people. And just like it was done, we can undo this. We can bring this back and have a revival right here with an industry that could make a real difference for people here at home.
Well, you remind me of the big thing that Obama was talking about on the run-up to the 2016 election. He's saying, Trump's saying all these things about the economy and how he's going to get the economy going, but there's no magic wand, right? There's no magic wand. And then suddenly when there was a magic wand, which was just, common sense economic policy, everybody in the media started to go, of course this is Obama's work that's really starting to bear fruit now. Well, hold on, I thought he said that there was no ability to do this. You can't have it both ways. And I think it's a very similar application in this regard. A lot of people want to talk about how it can't be done. I'm very pleased that people like you are talking about how it can be done. The website is joekentforcongress.com. I was reading I guess a couple of weeks ago, there was this letter to the editor of one of the local papers up there in Washington, and it was entitled, "Why I'm Voting for Joe Kent for Congress." And I'm sure you've seen this. Several of these paragraphs really stuck out to me, and I want to give our listeners a little taste of this. There was a town hall, I guess, that you were doing at Ridgefield in July, and the author of this letter says... Well, I'll skip the introduction of it because I want to talk to you about that. But it says, prior to the town hall, I was nervous and unsure of what to expect. As a recent high school graduate, I was one of the younger individuals at the event. Nonetheless, Joe Kent was happy to take my questions and treated me with respect. He is an approachable and genuine person. His campaign speech did not rely on GOP talking points. Republicans understand that socialism is an immoral ideology. This has been drilled into our heads by the conservative movement for decades, so I was pleasantly surprised when his speech focused on more pressing issues like the unprecedented power of big tech. It goes on, more details, more policy details. And then it says, listen to any of Kent's speeches, and it's clear he does not subscribe to the failed three-legged stool of conservatism, which is military interventionism, crony capitalism, and virtue signaling to social conservatives. If elected, Kent claims he will introduce legislation to withdraw troops from the Middle East. This is one of the main reasons I'll be voting for Joe Kent. I'm tired of Republican leaders romanticizing the founding fathers while failing to heed their warnings about foreign intervention. And I just thought that it was an incredibly well-crafted letter with a lot of interesting detail about your policy positions and your personal positions. So I wanted just to give our listeners who maybe, and I'm sure most of them have, at least heard of you if they haven't got into the nitty-gritty of the details of your platform, but just a little bit about you. 20 years in the military, 3 Bronze Stars. How did all of those things get you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I mean, as far back as I can remember when I was a kid, I just wanted to join the military and be a commando of some sort. This is, during the 80s and the 90s. And I saw in 1993 when we had the famous Black Hawk Down incident, I saw that, hey, there was people that, for all I knew, they were my next door neighbors that were out there fighting in like hard, savage fights. And I was like, I don't know who these guys are or why they're there, but if America needs people to go do that, I want to go do that. And so I joined the Army in '98, went to Ranger Regiment, became a Green Beret shortly after. Attacks 9/11 happened right after that. And I felt like I was in the best spot ever because I got to be one of the guys that would go and avenge this horrible terrorist attack that took place in our country. And I got to do some of that for sure, but I also spent a lot of time in Iraq, and I went to Iraq as a true believer, believing what pretty much the administration said, that, hey, there was links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, and if we didn't go take out Saddam right now, that there would be some other terrorist attack that stemmed from Iraq. I really thought that the government wouldn't lie about something this serious. But the longer I was there, and I spent pretty much every year of the war, I was there for at least 6 months, if not longer. And I worked a lot with the Iraqi security forces, standing them up. And I saw really quickly that, hey, the people that were making decisions, they weren't looking for the ground truth. There was no actual attempt to get things right. There was a party line that said we needed to continue to commit more and more to this place to build this government. And my question was always like, okay, what happens when if we can build this government? And the longer I was there, the more skeptical I was of that endeavor. But I was like, even if we did, what would we get out of it? Why aren't we just going after terrorists? I mean, none of it really made sense to me. I thought maybe there was an issue where those in power just weren't getting good ground truth. So I kind of gravitated over to the intelligence side of special operations, worked heavily in that. And it became very clear to me that there was a party line from both sides of the aisle, from the Bushites, and then we transitioned into the Obama era, where it was literally the prescription was we needed to be everywhere, constantly doing regime change, constantly doing this nation building. And so I was pretty, disenfranchised with both parties. And that was until Trump came on the scene, because the first thing that Trump did was he called all of that out. And he did it right to the face of the GOP and said, we got these wars wrong. We were lied to, and we need to get the heck out of them. We have to take out some problems that have festered since then. Trump was hard on getting rid of ISIS. We had to get rid of ISIS. And so I had the honor of serving under, all the different presidents before Trump. But then when Trump came in, he gave us the authorities and the resources we needed to take out ISIS, to check the Iranian aggression. But he did it all without getting us into a new war. My late wife was also in the military, someone I met through service. She was a Arabic linguist and intelligence operator. She was deployed to the final push during the final push to take out the Islamic Caliphate in Syria. She was there when we took out the last city that ISIS controlled. And so President Trump, then when we had done that, when we took out ISIS, we took away all the ground they controlled, Trump did something that no other president had done before. He said, hey, I'm on getting us out of these wars, and I'm pulling our troops out of Syria. And that's when the military-industrial complex, national security blob, whatever you want to call it, really turned their knives on President Trump. Secretary of Defense Mattis resigned. Brett McGurk, the special envoy from the State Department, resigned publicly. And they presented the case that Trump was somehow going to end the liberal world order by getting us out of a war. And the media jumped on it because they already hated Trump. And the bureaucrats below below Mattis and them, who were not elected by the American people, committed bureaucratic slow roll, left our troops in Syria. And a month later, my wife and 3 other Americans are killed by a suicide bomber. I had just finished my 20 years in the military, retired on a Friday, signed in, swore in at the CIA on a Monday to be a paramilitary operations officer. I was actually overseas when my wife was killed. So as I'm flying back to receive her remains, it occurred to me, we have 2 young kids, and I was like, hey, I have to retire. I have to get away from, getting shot at for a living, essentially, just to focus on my sons. I had the opportunity to meet President Trump a couple days later at Dover when my wife's remains were being returned to us. And I figured, hey, I'm just going to if I get a chance, I'm going to tell Trump or somebody that works for him that he's getting it right, but he's being undermined at every single level, because it was like nothing I had seen before, from the mid to the senior levels of the DOD and the intelligence community. The way that there was just vitriol and this culture of, hey, the president doesn't know what he's doing, but we're really in charge, which is completely against our system. And so I was like, I'm going to tell him that if I get a chance. And I did. I got a chance to meet President Trump. He's incredibly caring, incredibly gracious. It was obviously a very emotional moment. But I got the opportunity, and I figured, hey, I'm resigning from the CIA next week. Who cares? But I'm going to tell him. And I told him, hey, you're getting undermined at every level. I didn't think much would come from it, but Trump's an unconventional guy. And once he kind of learned, he asked me what my background was. And I said, well, my background's fighting these wars for my entire adult life. And he kind of dug into my background a little bit, and then put me in touch with some folks on his inner circle on the national security side. So I did some, I think, just unofficial advisory work for the Trump team on foreign policy, especially terrorism. And then as I was moving back here to the Pacific Northwest to get my two sons closer to my family. 2020 happened. The COVID lockdowns happened. Massive riots on the streets of my hometown, Portland, Oregon, close to the district I live in now. Antifa even came into our district. And really the way that the left weaponized Antifa and BLM was like nothing I had seen in America, but exactly what I had seen fighting overseas. You have these political movements, they have their political wing, they put out their messaging, but then they have their foot soldiers that go out and use violence as a tool to get a political ends. And that's exactly what I saw with Antifa. And I saw the way that Antifa was using their propaganda to really get a lot of passive support, either through intimidation or through ideological support from the population, to make the violence continue, to create this chaotic scene in 2020 leading up to the election. So I actually had an offer to go back and work in a second Trump administration on the national security side. And then the election happened, and we all know how that went. I mean, again, watching the machinery of unelected bureaucrats, big tech, the media move against Trump. And then the woman I voted for, who I'm running against now, Jamie Herrera Butler, who's a Republican, I thought for sure that she was going to be one of the ones, just due to how much pressure there was from the district. I thought she was going to be one of the ones to reject the electors on January 6th. And she came out pretty early and said that she was not going to do that, and that she completely disagreed with us, that there was any kind of discrepancies. And then the riot on the 6th happened, and then without any kind of due process, any laying out a timeline, Jamie Herrera Butler votes for the impeachment of President Trump. And so for me, I was like, okay, I see exactly what's going on here. We're on the cusp of losing our country. We literally live between two Antifa-controlled cities, Portland and Seattle, essentially. And now the election has just been stolen. And the woman who's supposed to defend us, this Republican who's supposed to defend us, is going along with it. So I basically called a couple people I knew from the Trump realm and said, hey, I'm going to go for this. And then I had to Google, how do you run for Congress, to figure out how to do an FEC report. And that's pretty much ever since then been off to the races.
Amazing. And it's been amazing to watch it all happen as well. Joe, I won't keep you too much longer, but I do want to ask you just a personal question, if I might, because this, sure. and you know, you don't need to, if you don't feel comfortable talking about it, feel free to brush me off. But you know, I've not served in the military. I've certainly not served in the military for 20 years. You clearly got a grasp of all of the inconsistencies, the lies, the poor strategies, poor tactics, and you saw it all along the way. Now, looking back at the last, 22 years, how personally do you deal with that? Knowing that you like you said, you were being shot at for this cause. You lost your wife as a result of the grander strategy that was being deployed by these what we dub now the international insecurity blob. How do you process, like, on a human level? How do you process something like that? Is it a daily thing? Is it how do you get up every morning and say, I just got to keep my eyes on the target ahead and not look back all the time and think, wow, how did I not see it back then?
Yeah, honestly, I really wish, I've said this a couple of times, I really wish that I could come back and be a true believer, like some people you hear. I wish I could come back and say, hey, these wars we fought, they were worth it. We got this tangible thing for our country. I wish there was some great victory we had, like our grandfathers did at the end of the Second World War. But really, for me, it's provided clarity. I mean, there's, as bad as truth can be sometimes, lies are much worse. So to still believe that the global war on terror was just that, and it was this war that we had to fight, all over the place, toppling regimes, that's a lie. And to live under the pretense that, like, we have to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, and all this other rhetoric that you hear that continues to make us make the same decisions, get us in the same messes, and exacerbate them even more, and cost us more lives and more trillions of dollars. To still live under that premise, I think would be a horrible and tragic thing. So I do like the fact that, hey, I've seen this, I've experienced it, and I want to be able to continue to drive forward to get our country back on track. And what I tell a lot of veterans that are having a hard time with this, and a lot of us are, and there's times where, especially as we were pulling out of Afghanistan, I mean, I was furious. I was furious that there was no accountability. All of it was finally coming unraveled, but I was mad, and a lot of guys were somewhere between enraged and very depressed. And what I say is, hey, the physical war that we went and we fought, we answered our nation's call because we love this country. We know what it represents. That's why we showed up in the first place. What the government did with us afterwards, that's on them. But right now, our fight's not over. We can't just come back and say, okay, well, it was all a lie, and now I'm going to be bitter about it. Like, I don't think we have that luxury right now. Like, we're on the cusp of losing our country, and so if we have a choice to make, we can continue to drive forward, knowing the truths that we know, or we can really just give in. And because I have kids, that's not an option for me, because I have two young sons. They lost their mom when they were really young, and someday they're going to look at me and say, hey, what was it all about? Like, why did she get killed? And I obviously, when they're old enough, I'll tell them all the details of how everything went. But I do want to be able to say, hey, guys, at the end of the day, our country is the greatest country in the history of the world. The West is the only hope for humanity, and I truly believe that. And so that's just what we have to continue to drive forward to. So I look at the physical war that I fought before as really just one battle. And we're still in this massive campaign to take our country back from the global elite and then from everything the left wants to do to not just us, but the entire Western civilization. So for me, it's, it is continue to drive forward and don't let them win. Because if we slip into despair, then that's exactly what they want. I feel like that's one of the left's big plans right now, is to have at least half of us just slip into despair, because then they don't really even need to lock us down again with COVID. They don't even need to steal elections. If half of us just stop participating because we're so full of despair, then they win. So I can't give them that.
That is an amazing way of putting it, and I hadn't thought about it like that. You are an inspiration, Joe.
Thank you.
And in so many ways, I mean, I was just reading on your site as well. We won't get into it now. I hope you'll come back at some point and talk about this as well. But the release you guys put out about banning Congress from trading stocks as well, we got to talk about that, because there are some extraordinarily heinous things going on right now. I mean, it's the fall of the Roman Empire, that kind of largesse you're seeing right now here on Capitol Hill. And I live, maybe 20 seconds away from the Capitol building. So believe me, can't nobody tell me about January the 6th, right? That was going on my doorstep. So, I hope you'll come back and we can talk about some of these other things as well. One last thing I wanted to ask you, your just thoughts on. I was in an Uber the other day, and that song, John Lennon, the Happy Christmas, War is Over song. You hear that every year, so this is Christmas, all this. And it occurred to me that it was about 100 days since the official drawdown date of the troops in Afghanistan. And I thought to myself, wow, there's a major, the world superpower ended a war, whether or not you think it was won or lost or whatever, like whoever is looking at this, you would have thought that 100-day mark, we're getting into the Christmas period, you'd think that there would be some kind of honoring of that. Somebody might give a speech about it. Somebody might, put out a press release. And then I realized, wow, they just really don't want to, because they don't want people to remember the imagery, what was just 100 days ago, of how poorly that whole thing was executed. And you just think that is genuinely a very weird thing, that war has come to end and we're not celebrating peace this Christmas. Isn't that strange?
Yeah, it's bizarre. And I mean, it's 20 years of conflict, close to 3,000 lives lost of American servicemen, more contractors, and then, who knows how many Afghans. And we can't even talk about it because, like you said, Biden doesn't want to talk about that. The regime, the media, they don't want to talk about that. Meanwhile, we're supposed to go last weekend and be very happy that the Army and Navy are playing some football game, and all the generals get to come and they get to watch this football game, in the Nike uniforms, like we have something to celebrate. And that's where a lot of my rage kind of kicks in. And I'm like, no, we should be talking about what happened in Afghanistan. There should be an Afghan War Commission right now, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs out there, and the coin get tossed to see who gets to do the kickoff. Like, that guy should be answering really pointed questions about why we lost 13 service members on our way out, why we flew over 100,000 unvetted Afghans into the heartland of America, why we conducted a blind drone strike that killed the wrong family, and then work backwards from there. How many lies did the brass tell over the last 20 years? I mean, we had the Afghan papers come out from the Washington Post. Like, why aren't we talking about this? I mean, like you said, it's breathtaking that we can't at least celebrate or have some sort of a tribute because, thank God there's no American service members engaged in combat, but you can't talk about that for too long because there's Americans stranded in Afghanistan because we abandoned them. So it's just on every level. The more you look at what the Biden regime and the left is doing and the globalist project, what they're doing, it has to just enrage you. I mean, and it has to inspire action because if it doesn't, I mean, again, we're on the cusp of losing the country. So it's just disgraceful.
Well, the good news is people like you are fighting. The good news is hopefully people like you will, well, I mean, I'm sorry about this, to say it this way, but you'll be here in Washington, D.C., so, it's not much to look forward to, but, we'll certainly try and, make you feel at home when you get here. Tell us a little bit about where people can go to support you, find out more about your campaign, and of course we haven't even mentioned it, you are the Trump-endorsed candidate in that race now.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, honored to receive President Trump's endorsement. That was obviously huge. Had a little bit of a relationship with Trump and when I announced, I got to meet him real quickly at Mar-a-Lago, and he was like, "Joe, I wanted to because I was going to hire you to come work." He's like, "But I got to see that you can stand alone as a candidate. You got to show me fundraising, polling, and volunteers." And I was like, "Okay, let's get off to the races and get going." And we did. We enlisted over almost 400 volunteers. We've done well over 100 in-person events, town halls. Raised in small donations. I'm not getting any PAC money because I'm going after an incumbent Republican. So there's like no PACs out there that even want to tempt me with any of that dirty money because I'm doing the taboo thing. So we've raised almost $1.5 million so far just on individual contributions from real Americans. And that was enough for the president. We got some good polling in too from Trafalgar that put me significantly in the lead. And so after that, President Trump went ahead and honored me with his endorsement in September. So good place to find me is JoeKentForCongress.com. That's kind of the touch point. You can make a donation there. You can find links to all the different social medias. We're on everything. We're on Getter. We're on Twitter and all that. But JoeKentForCongress.com. The small donations really help. So if people can give even just like $10, $15, that's actually how we're punching through this corporate establishment. Because and this is another thing that I think President Trump set the mold for, that you do this PAC money, you can get individual contributions, and then people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene have taken it to the next level by just having Americans support them directly. So JoeKentForCongress.com, people can support me directly, and we can take out this establishment.
Joe, thank you once again for joining us here on a Saturday, no less, as well. So Joe Kent, we will push our audience that way, and all the things will be in the description of this podcast. I will say this: $15, $20, that's all well and good. Dig deep, ladies and gentlemen. This is our guy, Joe. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Raheem. I really appreciate it.
Cheers. What an amazing story! What an amazing candidate! And we don't do endorsements over at the National Pulse. I don't think I'm allowed to as a foreign national. But I let me put it in the parlance of what was the people who were the apes, right? The apes who were doing all the GameStop stocks. I like the stock, right? I like Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm incredibly appreciative of your time listening to this show. Obviously, incredibly appreciative for Joe's time as well. So make it worth his while. Go to JoeKentForCongress.com, read about him, share his stuff. I want to thank all of the people who go over and support our work at fundrealnews.com. Just like Joe and that campaign, by the way. We are entirely people-funded. There's no PAC money. There's no corporate money. There's no billionaires behind the National Pulse. It's all you, and it all starts at fundrealnews.com. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but you can also give the gift of Real News this Christmas. If you go to giftrealnews.com, you'll actually be taken to a site where you can gift a National Pulse subscription to your friends, family members, colleagues, political enemies, and adversaries. That'll really wind them up. But I want to say thanks to the latest members: John, Ann, Marty, Roy, Catherine, Mary, Keith, Russ, Pamela, Alex, Christine, Lisa, Ron, Carol, Brandon, John, Fred, Renda, Andrew. Let's go. We'll keep going. Jonathan, Eugene, Mona, Bonnie, Scott, Mark, Kelly, Andrew, Corinne, Oh, I'm going to get this one wrong. Anthopny. Scott, David, Vince, John, Serena, Daniel, Walter, Wayne, Nadine, Sarah, Clyde, Jonathan, Matthew, Linda, Amy, Sharon, Suzanne, Liz, Linda, Cynthia, Michelle, Dan, Kathy, Weatherford. What a great name. Gary, Richard, Sandra, Maria, Ed, Alexander. The list goes on and on. We're so grateful. Make sure you share this, like it, leave a review, give us 5 stars, and I'll see you again next time.